Call to order this meeting. Bienvenue au Comité Sénatorial Permanent des Affaires.
Welcome to the Standing Senate Committee of Social Affairs, Science and Technology.
Chairman of the committee, and I would ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, starting on my left.
Chantal Petitclerc du Québec, Vice Chair of the Committee.
Tony Dean, representing Ontario.
Marie-Françoise Mégy from Quebec, from Montreal, Quebec.
Nancy Green-Rain from BC.
Judah Seidman from Montreal, Quebec, and Deputy Chair of the Committee.
Rosemary Poirier, New Brunswick.
And today we continue with the subject of Canada's post-war adoption mandate for unmarried mothers. This is the second meeting. We heard from a number of mothers and representatives of organizations last evening, as also adoptees. And today we're focusing on Australia because Australia has gone through the experience. This report that I have in front of me is the Community Affairs Reference Committee report on forced adoptions and policy practices dated February 2012. And I'm pleased to welcome the chair of that committee, by video conference, of course, Senator Rachel Siewert. And to you, Senator, I would say good morning because it's the morning of the 22nd, I believe, for you today.
Yes, that's right.
Today is the afternoon of the 21st, so I understand the 21st is a signature day for this report and the apology that was issued, and so we have this occasion to be able to welcome you. So, could we have your opening remarks, please?
Yes, and thank you. This was a very important inquiry for us, and you're right. For us, it's the 22nd. Yesterday was the 21st, and it was, in fact, the 5th anniversary of the apology. Some things have, some of the recommendations from our report have been implemented, but a lot haven't. So I'm going to keep my opening comments brief because you have the report. I think where I'll go at the moment is that, as I said, some of the recommendations have been implemented and some haven't. And I was talking to an adoptee yesterday who outlined some of the ongoing issues for both the mothers, the fathers, and particularly the adoptees. They're now starting to age as well, and there are a lot of issues that they still want resolved. So, for example, for those in the report, you'll see that there's a lot of discussion about access to records, which have not been resolved in this country in a lot of the states and for a lot of the mothers and families affected. The birth certificates, you'll see in Australia that the birth certificates were changed for adoptees, such that it reflected the adopting parents' names on the birth certificates, and there's a lot of distress that people are finding it hard to get their original birth certificates or get those birth certificates changed. They're also still finding it hard to access records. Some have not been available, some have been destroyed. They're also wanting to be able to access more broadly DNA services, for example. The counselling, a lot of people are deeply concerned about the quality of the counselling and also access to counselling, and issues around redress have still not been addressed. So they're some of the ongoing issues. I'd throw it back to you now I'm very happy to answer your questions, and if I can't answer them immediately, I'll take them on notice.
Perhaps I could start and then I'll call in the deputy chairs. I'm trying to determine how much of this is very similar to our conditions here. In Canada, of course, we have provinces, you have states, and we had various entities, some of them run by churches, maternity homes run by churches that were a part of the adoption mandate, as we call it. Now, have you the same situation there? Have the churches been involved in also in the apology and in the follow-up that the report calls for? And what about the states? Have you had good cooperation from them? Are you helping to provide for a national framework that in fact would help guide all of this between your government and the state governments?
Okay. So I'll go back to your first question in terms of the states. Yes, in terms of the religious institutions, yes, they were very heavily involved, and a great deal of them then either gave a separate apology and participated in the formal apology. There is still a lot of ill feeling between some of the mothers affected and also some of the adoptees. So I would say, and some of the women affected don't want anything to do with the institutions they are involved with, which some of the institutions, and in a minute I'll come back to a bit of an overall framework as well in terms of some of the other things that were occurring at the same time because they're interlinked. Some of the adoptees and the mothers involved want nothing to do with the churches. So if they're offering counselling services and and support services, they actually don't want to access them. They want to access independent counselling services and other sorts of support services. So around the same time that the forced adoptions were occurring was around the time that we had a lot of child migrants, the whole issue of child migrants from the UK, who were also suffering a lot in institutions. And we've had an apology to forgotten Australians, who are those Australians that were put in institutions as children, and to former child migrants. And there's a lot of ongoing issues there. And you're probably aware that there's been a Royal Commission into child sexual abuse of children in institutions, and that handed down an enormous report at the end of last year. By the way, there's going to be a formal apology to them. They've just established a committee of which I'll be on to develop that apology. And there's some ongoing issues there. And of course, then we've had the apology to the stolen generations of our First Peoples. So these three major issues are quite interlinked, and the institutions were involved in all of these situations. So sometimes it's difficult to unwind some of that, given the breadth of the issues that we're dealing with. I think you've had very similar situations as well. And so some of the relationships with the churches and the religious organisations aren't very good, but they are, most of them are trying to reach out and offer support. In terms of the states, yes, we have very similar situation to you. Each of the states has, they're responsible for adoption laws, and I'll come back to the adoption laws in a minute. We also have two territories, the Northern Territory and the ACT, for which the Commonwealth is more responsible and has more of an involvement and ability to try and influence some of the rules, but they also have their own parliaments, but it's a bit of a different relationship. In terms of the adoption laws, the Commonwealth was involved in the 60s in setting up model adoption legislation, which is why a lot of us feel that they are directly involved in this issue. The Commonwealth, however, cannot force the states to implement model legislation, although most of the states did. Adoption is becoming a huge issue in Australia again. It tailed off. If you've read I know that you've read our report, you'll see that it tailed off in the mid-70s. The peak was around 72, 73 of adoption, and it tailed off when Social Security came in, and adoption tailed off at that same time. but there's now an ongoing debate. In fact, on the morning news this morning, we had one of our ministers talking about wanting to change the adoption laws, which is reopening a very large wound for a lot of people.
Thank you very much. I'll now turn to the deputy chairs. Start with Senator Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you.
Being here in this early morning. I'm interested in knowing and reading the report, and I see one chapter really highlights the importance on counseling and support services, and we've heard witnesses yesterday and mothers actually who really told us how they did not have that kind of counseling and support when it did happen, but even after. So I want to hear you on how determinant your report and the formal apologies was in making sure that this was corrected after, now and after the report, in terms of what kind of an effect did it have to make sure that even if late, that support was came, if it did.
Okay. So our report, so when the apology was made, there was a package came down. Was also announced by the government, which offered a range of services. It didn't deal with the issue of redress, but a large part of that did relate to counselling and support services. So a lot of the focus of that package was in training psychologists, largely psychologists, in issues around counselling and support for adoptees, but particularly focusing on the women whose babies were taken. And I'm sure that when you heard yesterday from the mothers, you would have heard very similar circumstances, I suspect, that we heard. And it was a wide range of them, and they were pretty shocking and horrendous. And mothers, it's affected, you'll probably have heard yesterday, it's affected their whole lives, and it's affected their sons, the adoptees, their sons and daughters. So we needed counselling services for both the mothers and fathers and the adoptees. So in the evidence we heard, a lot of people were very critical of the lack of counselling, and when they did go for counselling, to psychologists, for example, some of them were just told to get over it. It was quite obvious that the profession did not understand the nature of the impact and the lifelong impact on mothers, in particular, who lost their child. Some of them never saw their child. You're aware of those circumstances. Adoptees thought their mothers didn't love them, and that's impacted on their whole lives. Whether they went to a happy situation in their adopted families, and many did, and many still, even though they had a good upbringing with loving parents, the adopting parents, they still felt something was missing. Anyway, sorry, that was a long answer, but what the package did was provide funding to provide training to the Australian Psychological Association to provide training to psychologists. That has ended, and develop a package for these psychologists. That has ended, and I've heard quite a bit of criticism about the fact that there doesn't seem to be an ongoing program of getting that training out and the manual out. There's no requirement for psychologists to read that. People are also critical of the fact that more funding wasn't provided for counselling, and the funding for the services, the link-up services that have been provided, and some of the other support services, for example, support to find your records, which is a major ongoing issue, and so people have been critical of that as well, and it runs out in 2 years, and in fact the people I was talking to yesterday were saying, we need ongoing funding, and we need funding for the sorts of things so we can chase DNA so I undertook to ask some questions of the government about that. The other point is that people say this, you don't get fixed by short-term counselling. These are lifelong impacts, and so therefore they need to have access to counselling lifelong. People have also raised the issue of, as people are ageing, they then, and it's the same with the former child migrants and forgotten Australians, they have fears about interacting with institutions again, particularly religious institutions, who provide some of the aged care services over here, who provide particularly residential services. So there's that ongoing issue as well that we need to be looking at. And we're not yet really fully comprehending or working out how we're going to address that issue either.
Okay. Next I have the other Deputy Chair, Senator Seidman.
Thank you, and thank you so much for being with us today. It's sometimes very challenging doing this by video conference, but we really appreciate the opportunity to discuss something with you that you've experienced and that we're now looking at. So if I might, I noticed that your report contains 20 recommendations, the Senate report. And I was wondering if, I know the government, we've heard the government did agree with these recommendations, but I'd like to know if all these recommendations have been carried out, enacted, or acted upon, and if not all, then which ones were not acted upon, and what were the challenges around those particular recommendations? Yeah.
My assessment is no, not all the recommendations have been carried out. Some haven't been carried out to their full extent. The issues, and in terms of, for example, the counselling, it's been carried out partly but not fully. The apology obviously has, and as you know, a number of our recommendations related to that apology. And I would say, there's a qualification on what I'm about to say. By and large, people were very pleased and happy with the apology. It was extremely well done by the government in terms of being inclusive. There was a reference committee set up that included 3 of the Senate. So the report, as you'll see, was a consensus report across both the government, which was a Labor government at the time, there were the coalition, which are the Liberal National Coalition, and ourselves. All agreed on this, which was really important. We really worked hard to get that consensus report. And so the government set up a committee, a reference committee to help develop the apology and provide some advice on the package, although we didn't get to see the package that the government announced at the time. We had a lot of input into it. The 3 key senators that were involved, or the representatives, I should say, of the 3 parties involved in the report were on the reference committee. It included women who had been affected by forced adoptions, who had their babies taken, and it included adoptees as well. And the government took on board a lot of our recommendations in terms of the apology. The problem with the apology was that just after it finished, there was political issue over here where there was a challenge to the Prime Minister, and that overshadowed the apology in the news. So that really upset a big group of people, because the apology in itself was very moving, as I said, very well done, and the government paid for people to be able to come to Canberra to hear the apology personally, and made a lot of effort. So that part of it was done. There was the counselling services, as I've described, the counselling services that don't go to the full extent, I don't think, of the recommendations. There was funding provided for the link-up services, for better to support people to find their records. What hasn't happened is some of the states have reacted differently to the recommendations, and so some states are better at access to information and their records. People were also transferred, babies were also transferred out of states, so that makes it hard, and their records are in another state. So, for example, some of the babies from Western Australia went to the eastern states, and so that makes it really hard to chase the records. I've already gone through the issue around the birth certificates. That still isn't resolved. Issues around adoption laws hasn't been addressed. As far as I'm aware, the states have not been talking about. We were talked about the issue around redress and encouraging the states to address that issue. They haven't, as far as I'm aware, addressed that issue. In fact, we're going through a issue at the moment in terms of the government is moving to put in a redress system for children that were sexually abused in institutions. There's legislation currently before the Parliament. In fact, we're in the middle of an inquiry into that legislation. Some of the adoptees that were in institutions are also involved in that issue, because you're probably aware from the report that some of the children ended up growing up in institutions. And so, and some of the evidence we received was that they're also abused in institutions. They're most likely also, therefore, to be involved in that process of redress. So they'll get redress for that. But there's no redress for those at the moment who weren't sexually abused but were abused in other ways in institutions. But in terms of specifically for adoptees that are affected and mothers are affected with those lifelong impacts that you'll have heard about and that we heard about, have not been addressed. So it's patchy, and there's, unfortunately over here, there's no requirement. These are recommendations. The government responded. You've probably seen the government's response, but there's no mechanism other than public pressure and pressure through, our parliamentary institution and their state institutions to require them to implement the recommendations. Sorry, I think I incompletely answered a previous question, and that is about the states. Western Australia has apologised. Most of the states now have done an apology through their parliaments as well. In fact, West Australians Parliament, my home state, apologised before even we started the inquiry. Does that answer your question?
Well, it's a good beginning. Thank you very much. One just quick follow-up, if I might, and that is, have the first recommendation was to implement a national framework to address the consequences. Has that national framework been established? No, it hasn't. Okay.
No,
Thank you very much.
No.
Thank you.
And next I have Senator Poirier.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation and for being with us. Really appreciate it. I have a couple of questions. The first one, following the government's response in 2013 with the promise of the various funding, how would you rate the impact of the apology and the funding? And was the response satisfactory to the people that were forced into adoption?
The apology, I'd say the apology was, yes, it was very accepted. The emotion in the room at the time was very intense, and I think people, sometimes it took a little while for it to sink in for people, because they'd been working for so long to get this issue on the national agenda, and they had been ignored for so long, that yes, I think the apology was accepted. As I said, the fact that the political commotion happened only hours later really upset people, a group of people. So yes, it was. The support services, felt that they went some way to addressing their issues, but a lot of people felt not far enough. And I've got a group of particularly women and a few adoptees, or mothers I should say, and adoptees who regularly ring me and so have some of the other senators who express concerns about the ongoing issues that they're not getting support for. So it's what I think some people in government and some people would say were insignificant, but they're very significant for adoptees. So this issue around not being able to get your proper birth certificates and get your birth parents on your certificates, I mean, basically they see their birth certificates as a lie. If they've got the adoptive parents on, they see that as a false document, as a lie. So they also have trouble, therefore, getting passports and things like that. That, for some, is a bit of an issue as well. So I'd say that there are still ongoing issues because the full range of issues haven't been addressed. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
I'm happy to keep...
Yeah. My second question is, in your recommendation actually number 10, where it says that you recommended that the financial contribution be sought from the state, the territory, governments, the institutions, the organizations that were involved in the practice of placing the children of single mothers for adoption, in support the funding for the service prescribed in the previous two recommendations. Has that been done? Did the government approve that? And is that working well?
Provided some services, as I've just... Sorry, can you... I can't hear you now.
Microphone's on.
Oh, that's it. I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. The government provided some funding support as part of the response to the committee and the package they announced with the apology. Some of those services are going to run out of funding, and that's where the lobbying's starting to see if they can be increased. Institution by institution, some institutions have been offering some services, but I'd say that was patchy, and a lot of the mothers and the adoptees, as I said earlier, don't want to be involved with those institutions. And there's not really, as far as I'm aware, a process where they can contribute funding to another service, this is the institutions, to actually help the people affected. So it's very patchy is my understanding, and of course it's state by state, and there's no coordination across the states for that other than if the institutions were coordinating that. I've got to also say that a lot of attention of the institutions has been focused very strongly on the Royal Commission that has just been completed into sexual abuse of children institutions. That has taken a lot of their attention, particularly some of the major institutions that were involved in that. So, for example, the Catholic Church, the Salvation Army in particular, and a number of other institutions have been very focused on that. So I would say that's also been taking quite a lot of their attention.
Okay, thank you.
So my overall assessment is that it has been inadequate.
Thank you. Senator Ahmedvar.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Senator, for being with us. I too realize how difficult it is. Yesterday, we had our first set of witnesses, and I heard something that was quite remarkable, and I thought I would check out whether you had the same experience. It was noted that mothers of color in Canada who fall into this discussion were given the resources to mother their babies because those black babies were not considered as valuable as blonde, blue-eyed babies. And so, as the witness said, it's probably the only time in history when a woman of color got a better deal. Can you describe your own experiences in Australia with the children of women of color?
That was not an issue that really came up. The issue for us was that we, at the same time that this was happening, it was in the period also, although of where we had the stolen generations and we had the stolen generations, you're aware of what we call that, where Aboriginal children were deliberately taken from their families and adopted into white families or non-Aboriginal families. And so that did occur. And so, no, we didn't have that situation that I'm aware of. In fact, it was the reverse, where Aboriginal children were being deliberately taken and adopted into white families. And that was children and babies were being taken. We did hear from Aboriginal mothers whose babies were taken at birth, although generally it was slightly older children were taken through the stolen generations. And we did, in fact, we heard from an Aboriginal adoptee who was taken out of the country to Scotland and had come home, and of course she had been removed and grew up outside her culture, and that has had a significant impact on her. So no, that situation did not occur in Western Australia. In Australia, I mentioned Western Australia because we had particularly awful situations with the amount of children taken through that period of the stolen generations.
Well, thank you. I have a second question. It goes to the recommendations in your report on public awareness, that the government should undertake public awareness activities. I also notice in your report that that there was an exhibition and you were or you wanted to host an exhibition. Can I get an assessment from you on how well the public awareness strategy has worked, and what would you recommend to us in terms of how, if we make this recommendation, what are some of the nuances that we need to consider, because you've gone before us in history and we can learn from you.
Okay. So I'll start with the exhibition. Again, the reference committee that was set up for the apology also was consulted over the exhibition, and that was first down at the National Archives, and I think the exhibition itself was very good. The complaints that I've heard, it travelled around Australia, and there was a group of women and a group of mothers that didn't like it, but by and large I'd say it was supported by the bulk of mothers and adoptees. The apology, of course, did get media, not as much as it should have because of the event that happened on the side, but it did get some media. In terms then of raising public awareness, quite frankly, more broadly in the community, I think a lot of people are still ignorant of the issues. There was some awareness and there was some media around the inquiry which helped a lot, and that was by and large, I'd say, fairly positive media about something that was really awful. It didn't demonise. In the past, you'll probably be aware that single mothers were demonised. I noticed you're calling the women unmarried mothers. I think we call the situation is generally called single mothers. I think that that awareness, that media was much more sympathetic than it had been in the past, where sometimes it was quite condemning of single mothers. So my answer is there's been some, but there hasn't been a coordinated approach to raising public awareness.
Senator Green-Rain.
Thank you very much for appearing with us today and giving us the benefit of your experience. I think you mentioned in your opening remarks that there was a manual that was developed for psychologists and that you were a bit concerned that they weren't reading it. But is that manual, would that be available for us to get here in Canada?
my understanding is that it's a series of like modules and things like that. Now, I've asked a question, in fact, of the government because some of the mothers contacted me and outlined their concern that that program of funding had finished, yet it didn't seem to be getting. They were concerned that it would just sit on the shelf, and so I've been chasing the government about how it's going to get out there. So I think there needed to be, from the limited information I've had about where that's up to, because it was up to then the association to get that information out. So, and mothers are the ones that are particularly concerned that it's not being taken up as it should. Now, I can take on notice where that's available because it's been told that it's up to the psychologist to get it out there and to encourage the psychologist to pick it up in terms of read it and start implementing it. So I can take that on notice to get back to you about where it's available, because it's not a publicly available document as far as I'm aware.
Yes, because I think that would be very helpful, because if you've funded and developed a training documentation for people counseling those with trauma, then it would be very helpful, I think, for us to look at it, because probably our cultural backgrounds are similar enough that it could be useful. The other question I wanted to just clarify for my own...
we have we do have a lot of deep similarities with the situations that you're facing there, so I'd say yes, it would be useful.
So the other question I had is, in Canada, statistics on births, deaths, marriages, and those kind of things are all kept provincially, and there isn't a national database of births and deaths, and so it sounds like it's the same in Australia. And when there is an adoption that crosses state lines, is there an obligation for one state to share the information with the other state? And so how is that tracked? I mean, we're all now looking at all the advertising on the internet about finding your genealogy, and I think in Canada we were surprised to find on St. Patrick's Day that we're all Irish, but genealogy is something that we would expect to find documented in our statistics. So how does it work in Australia with national and state statistics?
Okay, so it's one of the issues that the Community Affairs Committee invariably, in a whole lot of our inquiries, the issue about data and sharing data and the collection of data comes up. So on this one, and you're hearing from Daryl Higgins next, and he's from the Australian Institute of Welfare.
Protection Studies is what I have. Child Protection Studies.
Sorry, I get the acronym wrong on the name of it wrong all the time. But anyway, he was enormously useful to our committee. He has been doing a lot of work on adoption, so he will be able to tell you a lot more about those issues. But from our perspective, you're right, the states are responsible for those statistics, those areas. And in terms of the adoptions, we have quite much fewer adoptions now in Australia, although there's been, again, it was on the radio this morning, a bit of an increase in New South Wales. In the past, there has been no requirement for another state to provide information to somebody in say Western Australia. They then have to use that state's rules to get access to their records, not West Australian rules. There's no coordination at the moment, and there certainly wasn't then, around the rules around access to people's records, whether they're their medical records or their birth certificates, or the records, particularly the records of adoption. there were closed adoptions, and so that was particularly difficult, and there's been work to better coordinate that, but it's still, the feedback I'm getting from adoptees and mothers is that's still very difficult. And the issue here that I should also mention is some of the parents involved are now starting to pass away, and particularly the older ones, and that then closes off sometimes people's ability to find out more information. And you're right in terms of genealogy. A lot of our, particularly adoptees, are turning to trying to getting their DNA and using that as a way to trace people. But that we're at the very beginning of discussing it now, and Daryl should be able to help you a bit more about how they're dealing with that, if he knows how they're dealing with that, because it's an area that I don't know a lot about in terms of recording that.
Okay. Thank you, Senator Green. We've got 15 minutes left. I've got 3 more senators on the list. Senatrice Meiji.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you. Senator, I'm going to ask this question in French. Do you have the ability to hear the interpreter?
I'm told I'm
Testing 1, 2.
Yes, you don't have translation.
Parce qu'il va avoir un peu de délai.
Ah, OK. Ma question.
My question deals with international adoption at the current time. I know that right now we no longer demonize single mothers. Times have changed. We no longer have forced adoptions, but we still do have international adoptions. So do you find that the publication of your recommendations, do you think that this could help with different policies that could be applied at the current time with regards to international adoptions? Because we have adoption right now, and we might have some type of a comeback from children or their parents for international adoptions. Do you think that these could serve as lessons for current adoption policies?
Yes, I do. This issue came up during this inquiry, and it's come up in some of our other inquiries. So one of the issues was the debate was quite polarised in Australia around adoption overall, with a lot of those affected by these past practices who were very anti-adoption and said we should ban it completely. And then there was the other side of the debate, particularly for families who are unable to have children, and then the argument about providing permanent homes for people that are in out-of-home care. So it's still a very live debate here. In fact, as I said, it's kicked off again. In terms of international adoptions, a lot of the issues around international adoptions were very intensified because the issues that came up through the forced adoption practices highlighted a lot of the negative impacts that it can have, particularly for if you're unable to get access to your records, if you're unable to trace your birth family. That's even harder internationally. Also, the guarantee that there wasn't forced adoptions, because in Australia we've heard a lot about the unethical practices in some countries around taking children away from their birth families who weren't really orphans or weren't really supposed to be in institutions. So it's a bit of it raised all those issues, and it raised issues about the need for open adoptions, the need for children to be able to contact their birth parents and understand their family history, their backgrounds. And so, yes, I think there is a lot to learn for international adoptions. And as I said, there's still there's still a large group of people that think we shouldn't be facilitating international adoptions or adoptions at all, and now talk about permanent placements rather than adoptions, and a lot of changes. There has been a lot of changes already to adoption processes. They're open adoptions. Records now are much more available and there for the adoptee. So there are a lot of lessons we need to take from past practices for international adoptions, yes.
Okay.
Merci.
On to Senator Munson.
Thank you, Chair, very much, and thank you for being with us today or tonight, whatever time it is for you. Last night it was very emotional with mothers speaking to us in our committee, and of course everybody agreed that an apology is in order, a major apology. I've noticed out of the 20 recommendations, there are 7 that deal with an apology. The first 7 deal with an apology. And I was struck by recommendation number 6. I know we've talked about apologies, but it's suggested here the committee recommends that formal apologies should always be accompanied by undertakings to take concrete actions that offer appropriate redress for past mistakes. In your view, what is appropriate redress for past mistakes, and how can we learn from that here if we put that into our recommendations?
Okay. So firstly, when we heard evidence from our witnesses, particularly from mothers, it was very clear that people wanted an apology, but that there had to be something with it. And also the research that we did showed that apologies that weren't accompanied by concrete actions were often seen as useless or were only half-baked. The committee found it enormously emotional when we were hearing evidence from witnesses, from mothers and adoptees and grandparents and fathers, by the way. We talk about mothers a lot, but we got evidence from a number of fathers who were deeply affected by this as well. And we had counsellors in the room, and one in the room and sort of one in a separate room that people could go and talk to, because we found that we were very conscious of not re-traumatising people. And I just mention that because that was very important in terms of when people were giving us their evidence. Sometimes some mothers had never ever spoken about this before. It was the first time or publicly, it was the first time some people had spoken to us publicly. In terms of the concrete measures, so they're absolutely essential, which is why the government announced at the same time the package that we've been talking about in terms of the counselling support, the other support services. So yes, it's very important, and it's an issue of ongoing concern that the package didn't go far enough, or it still needs to be extended, and that people have lifelong impacts, so there needs to be more. But bottom line is it's very important that there are concrete measures announced with the apology.
Okay, let me follow up on this for a moment. Was there any request in terms of redress for individual redress by these people, or did they stick with pretty much what you recommended?
So there was a lot of concern around redress, that people should get some sort of financial redress as well. It's a very touchy issue over here, and in fact, there's a lot of us have been campaigning for a long time for redress for the stolen generations, financial redress, and that has not been addressed, and so there's ongoing campaign for reparations. And so we were very conscious of that in this committee report, and that's why, you know, we've been encouraging the states and the Commonwealth to talk about that. Various states have had bits and pieces of redress. Western Australia, we had a redress scheme. And I'll just note here, so there was an announcement of a redress scheme of which mainly centred on issues around abuse. So most of the adoptees and mothers would not have been included other than if adoptees were in institutions where they were abused. But they announced this redress scheme, and then the government changed. New government came in and halved it halfway through the process, and that was a disaster. It really didn't. It caused more trauma. So, you know, the take-home message there was when you do redress, make sure it's satisfactory and make sure you don't change the rules halfway through the process. So it is an ongoing issue where many of us feel there needs to be financial reparations on top of the other services that are provided.
Okay, I could explore that more, but I want to go because we're running out of time. To Senator Bernard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Senator, for being with us this evening. The question I wanted to ask, you partially answered already in response to the question that Senator Munson asked, and that's with regards to fathers. Last night we heard that there's very little attention paid to fathers in this whole discussion. And you've mentioned in your response that you had a few birth fathers, and I'm certainly aware of the broader context of child welfare, provision of services. Fathers are typically not involved. There's a whole body of literature that speaks to that. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about what your study did in terms of trying to hear from birth fathers.
So first off, it'd be, I think Daryl may be able to help with a few statistics in this area, but we had far more mothers, but than fathers. We, in terms of trying to get submissions, we advertised widely in terms of encouraging people to give us submissions, as did a number of the non-government organisations that, you know, and particularly the organisations that had set up to support mothers and largely mothers, and parents, but they were largely mothers and adoptees. Fathers, so I need to point out here that, you know, a lot of men have been, and fathers have been demonised as, you know, abandoning their partners when they became pregnant, and that did happen. I'm not pretending it didn't, but what happened here, a lot of the evidence we got was that fathers were actively pushed away because of there was a determined approach to take the babies, and so fathers, and it was easier if they were going to take the babies, it was easier just to deal with the mother. So in a number of cases we heard about, fathers wanted their names on the birth certificates. They wanted to be present, and they were actively ignored and pushed away by the authorities and by the institutions. So, we couldn't. You'll see from our report that really we can't get a handle on, and Daryl will be able to help you more with the statistics, but we weren't able at the time to get a handle on just how many forced adoptions there were in the overall number of adoptions in Australia. So I can't tell you the statistics on the fathers, and we weren't able to, but it's not as clear-cut as all fathers did not want to be involved. It's just not true. And the fathers that we did hear from were also deeply traumatised by the fact that they weren't able to have contact with their baby and their child, and that they have also suffered lifelong consequences from that.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of this session, unfortunately, because there's so much more I think we could explore with you, Senator Siewert, but I thank you very much for being with us, and congratulate you on this great work that you and your committee did back in 2012. And of course, this, at least in the Canadian time zone, is the 5th anniversary of the official apology.
Yeah.
And thank you very much for taking the time, and particularly an early time for you, to be with us today. And we will get the opportunity with Daryl Higgins to explore a little bit more in the next session coming up momentarily. So thank you again, Senator.
Thank you. I'm happy to take questions on notice.
Okay.
If you want to send some questions, I'm happy to answer them in writing.
Okay, well, thank you for that offer. And if you have any information, you did mention something in response to Senator Green Rain.
Yes.
And if you could send to the clerk of our committee, the clerk of the Social Affairs Committee of the Senate, that would be most helpful, and we'll get it to the members.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Colleagues, we'll pause for about 4 or 5 minutes. We have to get 2 more. This is an all video conference session, so we have to get 2 up for the next one from Melbourne, Australia, the other from Victoria, British Columbia. So we'll be about 4 or 5 minutes pausing while we get that all organized. You look puzzled. Committee members, we will now resume with our second panel of the day. And again, I draw your attention to the video conference screens. We have Professor Daryl Higgins, Director of the Institute of Child Protection Studies, Australian Catholic University. He's coming to us from Melbourne. He had a lot to do with this report that we've just had an hour-long conference with Senator Siewert in discussion. In fact, Senator Siewert, she referred to you, Mr. Higgins, a number of times as being able to answer some of the questions that we might have. And also from here in our own country, from Victoria, British Columbia, we have Veronica Strong-Boag, a historian and historical consultant, Professor Emerita at the University of British Columbia. Welcome to both of you, and of course in the case of Melbourne, Australia, I'll say good morning, and I'll say in the case of Victoria, good afternoon. We're later in the afternoon, but on the 21st of March here, as opposed to the 22nd of March in Australia. So welcome to both of you, and I'll start with Professor Higgins, if you have some opening comments that you could make about the report, about your role, and then I'll throw it open, after Professor Veronica Strong-Boag, I will then turn it over to the committee for questions. So, Professor Higgins.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Am I coming through okay?
Okay. I think we better put our earpieces on, colleagues. This would help. Okay, proceed, Professor Higgins.
Okay. You're able to hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
So thank you. So in the decades prior to the mid-1970s, it was common in Australia for babies of young, vulnerable women, mostly unwed, but not always, to be adopted. Shame and silence surrounded pregnancy out of wedlock, and this was matched by the mounting social pressure to meet the needs of infertile couples. And societal views that were reflected in organisational practices in places like hospitals, children's homes, government welfare departments and other agencies prioritised the needs of these, inverted commas, deserving infertile couples. The needs of single or other vulnerable young pregnant women giving birth were largely ignored. And so adoptions in Australia reached a peak of almost 10,000 per year in the early 1970s. Since then, rates have dropped significantly. Currently, less than 50 per year are local adoptions by unknown parties. And so when the adoption process in Australia was at its peak, adoptions were what we call closed. So closed adoptions is where an adopted child's original birth certificate was sealed forever and an amended birth certificate was issued that established the child's new identity and relationship with the adopted family. Mothers were not informed about adopted families, and the very fact of their adoption was usually kept secret from children. Changes in legislation now allow access to such information as long as no veto has been put in place by the other party. And the majority of local adoptions, those of children born or permanently residing in Australia, are now open. There's a range of reforms that have affected past practice, and these legislative and social reforms have contributed to the shifts away from this peak of adoption in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And they included, for example, the establishment of the Council of Single Mother and Her Children here in my state of Victoria in 1970, and then a national equivalent in 1973, that really helped to challenge the stigma of adoption and providing support to single and what was then called relinquishing mothers. A massive change, of course, was the status of illegitimacy changing to ex-nuptial births, and this began in 1974 in both Victoria and Tasmania. Abortion became allowable in most states from the early 1970s. In 1973, the Commonwealth government introduced a supporting mother's pension, which provided financial access that wasn't dependent on which state or territory you lived in. Further legislative reforms to overturn the blanket of secrecy surrounding adoption also occurred. Up to the changes in 1980s, information on parents was not available to adopted children, so that was a massive shift as well. There were also establishment of registers for those wanting to make contact, both for parents and adopted children, beginning in New South Wales in 1976. And the implementation of legislation in Victoria in 1984, granting adopted persons over the age of 18 the right to access their birth certificate, subject to mandatory counselling, with similar changes following in other states. And of course there was legislative changes in most of the 8 Australian states and territories by the early 1990s that ensured consent for adoption had come from both mothers and fathers. However, the damages that have incurred to many thousands of Australians prior to these reforms are certainly evident today. They're evident in the Australian government's formal apology in March 2013 for the Commonwealth's contribution to former forced adoption practices. And I know that you have heard from Senator Siewert about the inquiry that I contributed to that was groundbreaking in terms of putting on the national agenda these issues. And although legislative responsibility for adoption has remained with the states and territories, this collective responsibility and the national apology is an important acknowledgement of that national responsibility for the current and the implications that that provides for meeting the current service and support needs of those affected. And that's really where my role came in. As a researcher, I was asked, first of all, to look at what the state of the research evidence was about the number of people affected and the implications that an experience of forced adoption had on their lives. And I concluded in that initial report that we didn't have an adequate evidence base on which to base policy. And so on June 4th, 2010, the Community and Disability Services Ministers Conference, which is the Commonwealth coming together of the various state and territory ministers, announced that these ministers had agreed to a joint national research study into closed adoption and its effects to be conducted by my former institution, the Australian Institute of Family Studies, where I was the Deputy Director, and I led that work. The key focus of the study was on the current needs for services and supports and was designed to produce evidence that can assist with improving service responses to those affected by past practices, including the provision of information, counselling, search and contact services and other support. The study, the results of which are published in the report Past Adoption Practices, National Research Study on the Service Response to Past Adoption Practices, targeted a wide group of those with past adoption experiences. And it incorporated mixed methods, so online surveys, in-depth interviews and focus groups, integrating results across those different elements of the study and building on existing research and evidence about the extent and the effects of past adoption experiences in order to understand what the current needs are. So overall, we had more than 1,500 individuals across Australia participate in the study. The largest group were adults who were adopted as children, 823. We had 505 mothers, 94 adoptive parents, 94 other family members, and 12 fathers. In addition, we also surveyed 58 service providers about their views on the current service needs and service provision models for those affected by past adoption practices. And follow-up interviews and focus groups included over 300 participants in 19 locations across all of the states and territories. I'm happy to answer particular questions, but I will just point out a couple of key themes that emerged. One of the advantages to the study was that there was a nationally coherent voice among the participants, and although we applied a broad lens, we were able to reflect on some of the lessons learned regarding past adoption practices, with a specific focus on the currency of some of those issues for today's legal and ethical discussions related to things like assisted reproduction, current adoption practices, and permanency care planning. The particular things that I would point out, and happy to answer questions on, related to issues around identity, connection, and access to information. And that was particularly for that largest group of participants, those adults who, as children, were adopted. And they are the living examples of the outcomes of past policy practices. I also followed on with a scoping study that was commissioned by the National Apology Reference Group. And I'm sure you've heard about that work. And that was a scoping study of how best to respond to those needs. What are the best practice models for addressing those needs? And in that report, I developed service options that would enhance and complement the existing service system to improve support for people affected by forced adoption and past removal policies and practices. And that was subsequently funded and has now been implemented by the Australian government. And I've also had the privilege of working on a number of activities that were supported by that funding model, including a massive education program for a whole range of service providers who are delivering those counselling and support services for those affected. That's my opening remarks, and I'm happy to take questions when you're ready.
Thank you very much, Professor Higgins. I'll now ask for some comments, coming over to the Canadian side now, from Veronica Strong-Boag. Professor Strong-Boag, thank you.
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're coming through rather softly, but...
Okay, I apologize. I've got a very bad head cold, so I may have to sneeze in the middle of this. Thank you, first of all, for the invitation to speak to the committee. I come to this interview with a rather different perspective than Professor Higgins. As a historian, I've been studying child welfare in Canada in the 19th and 20th centuries, up indeed to near the present. And so I always see the situation of unwed women having to surrender their children after 1945 very much in the historical context of a shifting set of views about children and about women and about sexuality. I think, first of all, we have to see that the choice to surrender children or to have children taken from you is often not a real choice. It's always in the context of limited options and limited opportunities. That was true in the 19th century, and it remains true today. The other aspect that I think we need to acknowledge, probably in Australia as much as Canada, is the very diverse experiences that are reported from the territories and the provinces. Various racialized, classed, and otherwise distinguished communities had their own ways often of dealing with unmarried pregnancy. And these shifted over time, so they might look very different in the late 19th century than they do today. I think the other aspect of the issue that we confront, even today and certainly in the past and after 1945, is that misrepresentation and ignorance was very common in dealing with the question of unwed pregnancy. What I found in surveying, and I've surveyed all the records of all the provinces and all the territories between about 1860 to 1900, is that the data is often deeply flawed. It's underreported. Statistics Canada certainly cannot be trusted on any of the records. Families hid what they were doing, and often over the course of even just one generation, knowledge was lost. And so that many families have adoptees within them or have surrendered children that they still don't know about. And the silence around infanticide is part of the same story because the victims of infanticide were certainly disproportionately the children of unwed mothers. We also need to think about the historical context in which the treatment of unwed mothers after 1945 emerged. And it was very much at a time of the Cold War where we're seeing a reassertion of the notion of the priceless child in our battle with godless communism, and a sentimentalization and essentialization of motherhood, particularly for certain mothers, those who were white and those who were middle class. And these groups, white middle-class children and their mothers, were in ways that was previously largely unknown, suddenly became possible to save them, to rescue them. These women were seen, particularly teenagers, as psychologically maladjusted, and therefore were likely to, at least it was possible to think of, resocializing them to be better wives and mothers. This was, of course, considered much less likely for Indigenous women and women who were racialized, or indeed not part of the mainstream European fabric of the country. We have to remember that pregnancy still remained dangerous in this era. It was in the context of relatively high infant and high maternal mortality, particularly for women who were unmarried. And the cost of raising children was high, and was a calculation that families faced, and they faced in ways that limited their choices. I think we need to think of the treatment of unmarried mothers after 1945 as part of a sort of historical continuum in which children, and both girls and boys, have historically been readily shifted around in response to resources. That was certainly true in my family, and from what I can tell in the 19th and 20th centuries, it was true among many families. And the mothers who were most likely to have to give up their children were unwed mothers, usually giving them to their sisters. That was really quite common, and it's a historic pattern that actually we still see the remnants of today. So I really want to insist upon the diverse outcomes for mothers and offspring without negating in any way the tragedy that was involved on both sides. There are hard choices and hard outcomes. I think that we have to remember that single parenthood today, as in the past, and still more in the past, experienced continuing problems with support, both from within families who often felt stigmatized and their loss of respectability, and governments that certainly were unwilling to extend even the slow extension of social welfare to single mothers. British Columbia is distinguished after the First World War in extending the benefits of its mothers' pensions to single mothers, but that was not true across the country, so that single women would face very significant challenges in supporting their children. So single motherhood and motherhood in general, of course, remain dangerous for women and families. It also should be remembered that not all women or girls wanted to be mothers at any time or when they got pregnant, and not all women are good mothers. Certainly reading the accounts, as I've have read of children abused within families, there's plentiful reminders of mistreatment of children within families, even when parents are relatively well-to-do. That we have to see the difficulties of single parenthood as really about a desire to control female sexuality and shore up heterosexual marriage. And together with this, of course, we see the refusal to support contraception and the illegalization of both contraception and abortion. Secrecy became a sort of code word to spare supposedly birth mothers and their families and to reinforce images of normalcy. And there was often a circle of denial among many participants. So families from all stations of society have feared loss of respectability and the additional call on resources. And a 1991 report typically discovered that close to 80% of all unmarried mothers in Nova Scotia received and continued to receive child care help from relatives. Results could be tragic. One BC 5-year-old daughter of a young unwed mother who was handed around between relatives and neighbors so frequently that she understandably felt and acted as if she belonged nowhere and was a confirmed runaway was a typical casualty. Now, Ontario social work scholar Cyril Greenland captured the special vulnerability of these children when he observed that maternal child abusers in Ontario, like many in the UK and the USA, have commonly been teenagers, pregnant, depressed, previous state wards, brutalized, and abandoned by adult men and economically marginal. So we don't want to romanticize the outcome of keeping children. Now, unwed mothers in institutions after World War II, it was really a 20th century phenomenon, with the exception of the Catholic Church that had some of these institutions in Quebec earlier on. These institutions were run overwhelmingly by churches, although there were private operations as well. The church-run ones tended to be cheaper. They were not comparable to the federal government's invested in a genocidal program of residential schools for Indigenous students. But they were a reflection of pervasive investment in patriarchy by most Canadian communities. Now, institutions for the unwed offered diverse treatment within them, and it often reflected whatever sort of cultural capital the girls and young women were believed to bring with them. So they could be treated better or worse depending on who they believe, who the runners of the organizers of the institution believed their relatives were. But the treatment would have been very much determined by the class and racial background of the mothers. And until after World War II, children of unmarried mothers were likely to be highly stigmatized and not ready candidates for adoption. After World War II, young mothers, especially from the white middle class, became more acceptable as candidates because, again, they were believed they could be remade psychologically. But they could only be remade psychologically if they gave up their children. And the children, too, would have to be remade. So in conclusion, whatever their origins, in the past as now, unwed mothers confronted a terrible contradiction. Most desperately needed paid employment and further education often, but not being in the home ensured that they would be censured as bad mothers. Their predicament was all the more inevitable because day nurseries have been, as one angry social worker noted in 1950, few and far between in Canada. And that comment of that social worker reminds us that social workers are not always the enemy, or even often the enemy. They too were working in a context of limited options and general prejudice against unwed mothers. So all things being equal, few women ever chose single parenthood. As one British study has argued, even when well-loved, illegitimate children were a terrible burden, financially, emotionally, and socially. Some ambivalence from their mothers was all but inevitable. One Canadian teen, despite her supportive parents, spoke for many before and after in concluding, "I have to give up my child, not because I really wanted to, but because I knew it would be better for him. I was only 15, with a grade 10 education, no husband, and no means of support. I wish I could have kept him." Unquote. Single mothers then have been effectively punished if they kept or if they surrendered children. Consequences for both could be severe. There were only hard choices and uncertain outcomes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I wonder if I could, first of all, ask you a question while you're on the screen, Professor Strong-Boag. You talked about the church involvement in this. What about the federal government involvement? Can you outline in what ways the federal government facilitated the kind of adoption practices that occurred after the war and up until the 70s?
The federal government had no direct involvement. Certainly, there may have been some funding that came for support of child welfare on an occasional basis, but it was certainly not true for the institutions for unwed mothers. It did not come from the federal government. It came from the churches. It came from volunteers. It came from private charities, and some of it, very little, certainly not enough to support women and children in any dignity, came from the provinces and the local municipalities. I noticed one of your commentators in the data that I got today suggested that Canada helped fund that in the Canada Assistance Plan, I think. That was later on. I mean, if you're looking at the period from 1945 to 1960, there's really no federal involvement. I mean, the feds are as complicit as everyone else is in, I suspect if you did a survey, in fact, I'm absolutely positive, if you did a survey of MPs and bureaucrats in Ottawa, they would have felt that unwed motherhood brought stigma on the family and shouldn't be rewarded in any way by state support.
National Adoption Desk.
Yes, there was the National Adoption Desk, but that emerged very much in response to the increasing destigmatization of the idea of adoption, and it was particularly interested, of course, in international adoptions. You have to see their work as often associated with trying to get supposedly unadoptable children who are often Indigenous from one part of the country to another, and was often involved tangentially at least, and sometimes more than that, with the Vietnamese adoptions and some of the beginning of the Asian adoptions as well. But it was always underfunded. It had a very difficult relationship with the provincial governments, which did not want to support it. And so in any meaningful way, it was not meaningful except in the general sense that it was part and parcel of the general sort of feeling that women who got pregnant, if they didn't deserve what they got, they were certainly victims, and their children should be rescued as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. I'm now going to ask my colleagues in the committee to ask questions. And I'm going to ask my colleagues to direct their question to either of our panelists. We need to particularly do that on a video conference, and particularly because of the delays in the communication. So please indicate at the beginning which of the two professors you wish to direct your question to. Start with Senator Seidman.
Thank you, and thank you both very much for your presentations. I'm going to address my question, if I may, to you, Professor Higgins. So the themes of the recommendations of the Australian Senate study, as we just heard, focused around redress for the so-called adoption mandate, essentially forced adoption policies. And those themes were apology, financial contributions, and support counseling and other services. And you, Professor Higgins, did talk about service needs and best practice models for addressing the needs of those affected. And so it's a really important issue, and it's important, obviously, for us in this study to try to come up with some recommendations ourselves as a result of doing this. So what would you tell us about this particular aspect, the service needs? What kind of recommendations would be really critical to put forward?
Thank you. Look, I suppose the first thing I would say, the report that I led for the it's funded by the Department of Social Services, but it was really for the implementation working group that flowed from the findings of the Senate inquiry and then the national apology. That scoping study, I think, would have direct relevance for your work, because what I outlined there is what the key needs are that each of those groups talked about, but particularly the mothers. There is very strong representation from mothers about the trauma that they had experienced and what would help them. The other important caveat to note, though, was the report was being done in the context that the National Apology Implementation Working Group had already been advised that there was $11.5 million available, which is not a large amount of money. It's a very small amount of money. So my job in conducting the scoping study was not to paint, blue skies, let's do all the bells and whistles. It was saying, in the context of very constrained resources, how can we get the most effective service response? So one of the key principles that I outlined was, where are the ways that people who are experiencing trauma might already be able to get services, but there are obstacles, either because they don't feel as though, and this was an important theme from the research, they don't feel as though they're going to be believed, they have to tell their own story and be the expert in their own situation. But health professionals who are already funded in a whole range of ways. So I'm talking about, general practitioners in the medical field. We're talking about, mental health nurses. We're talking about psychologists. We're talking about psychiatrists, etc. They're already funded in their own way. So it wasn't like we needed more of them to be able to deal with this. What we needed was for them to be sensitive to the issue and to have practice models that fitted in with their own way of operating. So if you're already a clinician working within a psychiatric framework, how do you apply the understanding of what are the needs and issues faced by a mother in her 70s who maybe has had some contact but is no longer in a relationship with a son or daughter that she was separated from. So it was really about trying to identify what would be the best way of upskilling that workforce. And then the second thing was the issue of adoption-specific services. So there were a number of services run in each of the separate states and territories that often grew up very much from a peer support base, and it was about assisting with that process of making contact, dealing with the veto, supporting, reaching out, whether it be from a, adoptee to a mother or a father where they're aware of it. But those organisations also needed support. So that was sort of the second tranche of the model that I outlined, was how to best kind of support those agencies to do the job that they do, but recognising that they're only going to be dealing with a relatively small number when they're going through that process of finding, making contact, or just needing peer support. So I kind of held those two things in tension and tried to address recommendations that were about both the larger group of mainstream, mental health and support workers, while at the same time supporting that narrower group of specialists.
I might just ask, what would be the primary role for the federal government? I guess in Australia you call it the federal government as well.
Commonwealth.
The Commonwealth, okay.
Yes, well, Commonwealth. It does depend on where the funding comes for those different things. So most of the services that I just outlined, psychiatric services, psychological services, GPs and so forth, are funded through grants from the Commonwealth Department of Health. Even though they might then be administered at the state level, and there's a whole lot of arrangements, and of course a lot of people might see psychologists or psychiatrists privately, but there's still rebates through our national Medicare system. So the access to those services is already there. The biggest issue was the skill set. So what happened was, on the basis of my recommendations, there was a funding stream put out to do exactly what I said, build the capacity of those mainstream service providers. And so an organisation, it happened to be a professional body, it was the Australian Psychological Society, but it could have been anybody, won that tender. And what they did was they reached out to all of those different kind of mental health groups and created a really comprehensive package of education. And I was then brought back in as an expert advisor to it. But what they did was they had representation from each of those groups on the working party that actually developed up what does the content need to be, how does this work with the way that my profession, operates, the kind of practice models, if you like, that I would use. So it was not, someone from outside teaching you how to suck eggs. It was a psychologist saying, well, here's how a psychologist would work. It was a clinical social worker saying, here's how a clinical social worker would work, and these are the ways in which this additional information can be communicated and supported. And those resources are already there. So I would recommend not duplicating, but perhaps entering into a relationship with the Australian Department of Health to get access to those, because it was an online system of learning, very rigorous, and it featured video presentations from a number of experts that then are explored in an online learning environment. The Australian Psychological Society also backed it up with webinars, so where practitioners would be able to log in, have an expert, or in fact usually it was 2 or 3 experts talking together about a particular topic. It could have been to do with grief, it could have been to do with managing first contact with family, it could have been to do with relationship breakdowns or something, but just picking one particular aspect and trying to bring in an interdisciplinary perspective to that.
Okay, thank you. Senatrice Petitclerc.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. I will ask my question to Professor Strong-Boag. I want to have your input as an historian on something that really resonated with me yesterday when we had some mothers talking about their experiences, and we also had a lot of testimonies that we received in the form of writing. And one of the things that I want to have your historical clarification on is, we heard a lot of the fact that there was not really an option to give up the child, but we also heard or read some mothers who said that, and maybe it's later on in the 60s, that when those options or emerging services or social programs and support started to emerge, even in that case, the mothers were not being informed that maybe they could have some help. And I found that, shocking, really, that and the mothers sometimes wrote that they learned about that a few years or a few months after they gave up their babies. They learned of existing, limited and emerging social program that could have made a big difference in their non-choice, really. So I want to, in fact, I want to know if it's just very isolated, or if there was a time in history where this started to happen, but still the mothers did not have that options presented to them.
I think that you're quite right to say, as I'm sure your witnesses have said, that there were emerging programs, but they were always underfunded. Application was difficult. Social workers had tremendous caseloads. And their assumption, as they looked at the choices for white middle-class children, or children who could be presumed to be white and middle-class, was that there were better options. In other words, options that involved greater amount of support and income and and housing and stuff than would be available to unwed mothers. And if we look at the situation just today, and if we look at children who are in the welfare system and who often go into foster care, is you can see that the welfare system in, you know, a less benighted age we might be, but children are, and their mothers are significantly underfunded today. And that was certainly very true in the period immediately after World War II. So I think that it is correct that social workers either withheld the information, or often, you know, they didn't know the information. The information was often not readily available to social workers. We tend to think social workers were right on top of all the newest data, but we can tell, you know, that's easy to say from hindsight, but that the provincial regulations and territorial regulations differed substantially from one region to another, and that social workers, particularly overworked social workers, with far too many children and mothers in their care, were often not well equipped to provide any information. And it is a reminder that when you're caring for children and the parents associated with them, that you need a diverse range of supports, and those supports weren't often there, and that the same social workers who were also handling adoption became a more specialized area for social workers later on, certainly by the 70s. But previously, they were the same people who were also dealing with terrible tragedies occurring in child welfare and children abused within homes. And so it was easy for them to make a connection between children who were being abused by their families, their birth families, and children of unwed mothers. And that they saw themselves, I think, I think that they believed they were doing the best job for children and mothers. They could see what the options were, and they had their own terrible stories, which is why, of course, child welfare remains, you know, very difficult to staff today. And if you look at the period throughout the 20th century, most people went into child welfare and got out of it fairly quickly.
Thank you.
We're going to have to say goodbye to Professor Higgins because, although we're almost out of our time, but we apparently are having some technical difficulties. There's some noise in the sound system, which is making it difficult for our interpreters to translate into French, and we're required. Our requirements are to be able to do it in both official languages, but apparently the background noise is creating a problem. So what I would suggest, if any member of the committee has a question they wanted to put to Professor Higgins, that perhaps we could send it to him by email and perhaps get a response back. Would that be okay, Professor Higgins?
That's fine.
Okay, and so let me thank you very much for coming on and talking with us today and giving us more of the Australian experience. And we'll carry on now with we'll say goodbye to you, and we'll carry on for a few more minutes with Professor Veronica Strong-Boag. Thank you. So I now have Senator Bernard. And we have one panelist now. Sorry about that.
I'll be very quick. So, thank you for being with us. We heard a lot last night about just the social work practices and how unfair, unjust, controlling they were. And you've shared very similar things today. And so I'm wondering if there are suggestions you would make to us in terms of what should be happening in social work education to better prepare social workers for this type of work.
Yes, I think that's a very important part of the solution, both for folks who sacrificed, hopes and dreams with children or with parents in the past, and in the present with adoption and fostering. I think that it's very easy to scapegoat social workers. They remain, the problem rather than the society remaining the problem. And I think it's clearly the society which underfunds child welfare today as it did in the past. And that if we look at social work programs, we need to talk about programs that are much more engaged in talking about racialization, sexual identity, the multiple identities that people bring to the table as adopters, as birth parents, and as children within those families. And that I think, I've talked to friends in social work at UBC, and they say that often we have students who come into social work and really dream of working with children, but their caseloads are so enormous that burnout is a really common phenomenon. And certainly, if I look at the 20th century, I think that is seen throughout the 20th century, is that people have too many children to really be conscious of what their situation is. And in face of children's needs, I think it's easy and somewhat understandable to see how mothers' needs get sacrificed as social workers are preoccupied with outcomes for children. And they have just too many children in their caseloads. And I think that's the problem.
Okay, thank you. And finally, we have Senator Greenray.
Yes, thank you very much, and really appreciate your experience and your studying of this issue over so many years. I just would like to ask you, in today's situation, it is, obviously we have to do an apology and fix what happened in the past. But moving forward, is there anything, because we still have adoption policies that are different from province to province and in the territories, is there anything that you could recommend, or could you send us what you would think would be the ideal situation for closed and open adoptions, and what needs to be gathered at the birth, including information from both families of the parents of the adopted baby? So do you have any thoughts on that, something you'd like to share?
Yes, I do. Certainly I was continually struck by how it is often, not always, but often better to have full disclosure. And as soon as the child, is certainly old enough to understand, and it should be, the information should be given in age-specific ways. I think all governments should commit themselves to this and provide support for adoptees and children who are in the foster care system, where they often ended up as well, for the possibility of reuniting, also for birth parents. And I could see the federal government having a role to play in, a truly Canadian adoption desk, which would provide, because the information is often very hard to access, and to have a sort of ready source of information for children or grown-up adoptees and foster children to find the information that they need. And similarly, that this communication could be sort of regularized with the territories and the provinces. And that will do much to destigmatize, relations which have often been very difficult. I have to say that there are also exceptions. We have to, I think, proceed very gingerly, because there's certainly cases of incest, there's cases of rape, there's cases that make the recovery of the past is always not only contentious, but is tragic, and that people need to be provided with supports to handle that tragedy, particularly around incest and rape, obviously. Because that is still a story, or stories that are still more hidden than adoption and surrendering children.
Okay. Well, that brings us right up to 6:15, which is the end of our meeting. And so let me thank you, Professor Strong-Boag, for being with us from Victoria, and for your insights into this matter. Thank you very much. And
You're welcome.
colleagues, this completes our second meeting on the subject. Our third will be tomorrow morning at 10:30. And we have some people here actually tomorrow. This is the first time I recall us having a meeting which was totally a video conference. Anyway, with that, there's nothing else we need to do, so I declare the meeting adjourned.